Thanks so much.
Should we get started?
Yes.
Okay. Again, like Lisa said, thank you, Lisa. I love Unsung Heroes, an amazing project. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, Google it. It's just really an incredible thing that Lisa does. And thanks to Barbara for having us here. I am thrilled to be here. You are such an inspiration, Betty. So I'm excited to chat with you.
Don't be too.
All right, so let's just talk about your book, Sign My Name to Freedom.
Yeah.
What kind of got you writing this book, and what's the story behind the title?
The book grew out of the fact that I was living in Walnut Creek in the suburbs, and one of our church members of the Unitarian Church there was taking off. It was 1964. She was taking off to join a team of young people who were leaving Cal. She was entering as a freshman to teach in a freedom school in Canton, Mississippi, as a member of SNCC. The night before Susan was to leave, her family had me in to a little farewell dinner, at which time I impulsively gave Susan the string of pearls that I had around my neck, which had been given to me on my wedding day. I asked her to wear those pearls underneath her t-shirts so I could have a presence in Mississippi as she was doing her work. And she did. We connected at that point. I guess I taught Susan in Sunday school, but in her letters home, she wrote about the fact that this woman in Canton, Mississippi, who was a black woman, had opened her home to SNCC, that there were a number of the students from the Nonviolent Coordinating Committee who were living with her. She had dared, at the risk of her life, to go down to the courthouse and to register to vote against all odds. I knew that from letters home because Susan held her in such high esteem. She realized what that woman was risking. I wrote Sign My Name to Freedom in celebration of this woman that I only lived in my imagination. But it came at a time when I was unwittingly recording, documenting the Civil Rights Revolution without knowing that's what I was doing. And Sign My Name came out of that. And when the book was published, it was one of the names that was submitted to the publisher that was accepted.
Yeah. Are you happy that that was the one that was accepted?
Actually, I was disappointed, but I've since learned to accept it.
What was the one you wanted?
There's a great story about my great-grandmother, that my grandfather, with whom I spent most time, he was my best friend by the time I was about 6 years old, until I was 13. He used to tell me about my great-grandmother, Leontine Bro Allen, who was born into slavery, 1846, in St. James Parish, Louisiana. She was enslaved until she was 19 and freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. She became, for her village, the village midwife. She delivered all of the babies as an adult. She also was the person in that community in St. James Parish who met with Dr. Heidel, who was a circuit riding doctor who came through about every 3 months on horseback. And her job, before he came through, was to go out and hang a white towel on the gatepost of every place where he was to visit. That image had always stayed with me. And I knew her because I was 27 years old when my slave ancestor died. I was married and a mother, so I knew her. That image of her draping white towels on fence posts had stayed with me my whole life. And it is, as Stephen Sondheim says, children will listen, because I realized that I had spent my whole life hanging imaginary white towels on gateposts, that I had been offered jobs of leadership. I'd always chosen to be the second in command, that I was already doing that when I was working for Dion Arner as a field representative, the state of California. And I'm also doing it now as a park ranger for the National Park Service. That I had always turned down that leadership role in favor of hanging imaginary white towels on gateposts. And that's what I wanted the book to be read. I wanted it to be white towels on gateposts. But you would have had to read so far into the book to even know what that meant. That the publishers were right when they decided that this was not appropriate.
It's a great story, though, and I was, of course, going to ask you about your great-grandmother. I guess on top of that, is there any piece of advice that she gave you that's just resonated with you and stuck with you?
No, because she only spoke a patois French, which was a language that was lost to my family during my childhood, which is pretty much the way it is with second-generation people who are bilingual. My parents still talked Creole, but I didn't. I learned about her through my mother's younger sister and my grandfather. I don't remember having conversations with her ever because she never came to California. She remained in St. James Parish, Louisiana, and I came here as a 6-year-old. So my connection with her came through visits because our families were mostly, the men were mostly Pullman porters. So we had family passes to visit New Orleans. I would go home as a family designate several times during my childhood, my teenage, because she became the magnet on her birthday every year. And people would gather from all around the country to join her to celebrate these birthdays, especially in her later life. So I was able to do that.
She lived to be, what, 100?
102. Yeah, she died in 1948.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you say it's genetics, or what do you attribute it to?
I can't believe that it's not just simply genetics, because my grandmother lived to be 102, going from 1846 to 1948. My mother was born, who was raised by my great-grandmother, because her own mother died. Mother was 7 months old. But my mother was born 1894 and lived to be 101, dying in 1995. And I was born in 1921 and celebrated my 97th birthday back in September. So that means that the three of us, that those 3 lives, bridged everything in the American narrative from the Dred Scott decision to Black Lives Matter.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Gives you chills. You know, it's amazing, the amount of history that your family has experienced. Let's just go back to your childhood. You were born in 1921. What was life like for you as a child and as a teenager?
Well, I came to California as a 6-year-old, but I had been born in Detroit, Michigan. And that was, if anyone has read that incredible book by Isabel Wilkerson, The Warmth of Other Suns. If you've read that, you know that there was this exodus of people throughout the country. We were refugees in our own country, and my family was no exception to that. My grandfather was a builder in New Orleans, responsible for many important edifices. He was well known, was a contractor, an engineer, and a millwright. Long before you could get patents if you were a person of color, so that his inventions could not be applied. He'd have to go through a white person to do them. any of the buildings that he built had to be done under the permits and the licenses of a white contractor, so that nothing that he had built had his name on it. So that at the time before I was born, my father and my grandfather were in his home office when a white man walked in off the street. He came up to them, and my father, of course, was apprenticed to his father, and said something to my grandfather, addressing him as Louis, which is, of course, the French pronunciation of Louis. My father, who was a very proud Creole, took offense to that and said, "Do you know to whom you are speaking, Harry?" At a time when white men could only be addressed by their last names if a person of color was addressing them, and black men were addressed by their first names. My family had to get my father out of New Orleans before sundown, because he had addressed a white man by his first name. My mother's had some family in Detroit, Michigan, who were working in the Ford plant, so that they got the family. My mother was pregnant with my older sister, my mother, my father, and pregnant with my older sister, got on a train and went to Detroit, where I was born 4 years later. It was at the time that I think I must have been 3 when my grandfather was dying that my family returned then to New Orleans. I don't remember New Orleans at that time, but I was there in New Orleans until I was 6. So in childhood, I grew up pretty much as a second-generation Californian. I don't remember much about New Orleans. What I do remember is in the book, but it's sketchy.
When do you think it was in your life, in your childhood or in your youth, that you became keenly aware of race and race relations?
Well, as other children, my life was made up when I was a small child of family members. So that I don't remember being introduced to the problems of race, because at the time that I was a child, there weren't enough of us. Bigotry and segregation existed, of course. It had always. But there weren't enough of us, people of color, between Monterey and Sacramento to make any rules against. So that the segregation was implicit. It was built into grants, into deeds, where people could buy property, but it wasn't. There weren't signs that said that you couldn't drink in this white fountain or that fountain, or black people. So that I didn't grow up with the kind of segregation that entered our areas with the Second World War. It was. In fact, there were times, because my social life was completely with either my family or the Creole families who had moved out of New Orleans, so that they had settled here. So that my life did not become formally segregated until the Second World War. And there were times when I didn't know whether we were separate because we preferred it that way or whether we were separate because we were being left out. I mean, I just didn't know.
Right.
As a kid. And I think that a lot of us didn't.
Right. Particularly in California, it's a different, it's not the deep South at that time. Right.
I guess when I got to high school, I'd gotten the message by then. Yeah.
Right. So you graduate high school and you get married pretty much right after. But somewhere along the way you dated Jackie Robinson, I heard you say, is that right?
Oh yes, Jackie Robinson and a lot of Tuskegee Airmen. As an aside, it was fascinating. It was Women's History Month when I was invited to go down to Moton Field to do a presentation at the Tuskegee Institute. And when I walked into that hangar, that's now a museum. Here was one of my dates on the wall, blown up.
Bit of a heartbreaker in high school?
No one knew.
I said, were you a bit of a heartbreaker in high school? But,
I didn't know it then.
yeah.
I think in looking back, yeah, I must have been one hot dish, but I didn't know it then. My ego couldn't afford it.
Oh, I love it. Okay, so you get married at 19, and at that point, it was at the start of the war, right? About the start of the war?
The war broke out in December of 1941. I was married in May of 1942.
Okay. Yeah. So what kind of aspirations did you have for yourself at that point in your life? Obviously, there weren't a lot of opportunities for women, particularly women of color.
No, and it's also true. It's so hard to make the case for feminism at this point because there's been so much change. But at that time, a successful woman was a woman who was married by the time she was 23 and had her first baby by the time she was 25. And I was compliant with that whole thing. So I don't remember having, it's also true that I remember a conversation my mother and my aunt were having that I should have known was significant then, but I didn't. I only know it in retrospect. But my mother was talking about a young daughter of their friends and saying they should certainly better educate that girl because she's never going to get a husband. Which shows you that my parents didn't even aspire to having me be educated at all.
Right.
And and according to the recipe, I was married by the time I was 20.
Right.
Yeah.
And then not long after that, you started working at the Boilers Maker Union, and what kind of work were you doing there?
I started to work for the Boilermakers at a time when I was working actually at the FBI headquarters in the basement of the federal building in San Francisco. And it meant that I was commuting across the bay. And at that time, this would have been when our main transportation was ferries. The risk that I would be caught across the bay in a blackout became so strong with my parents that they insisted that I transfer to a job on this side of the bay, on the east side of the bay. And that was, of course, just before I was married. And I did that, but because I was a transfer, I didn't have to make out any federal papers. And somehow my race got lost in the transfer. And I got a job under the transfer working for the Air Force in the Leamington Hotel. They'd taken over the Leamington Hotel in downtown Oakland. But I didn't realize I had taken a job that I was not qualified for by my race. I was there only, I think, just a few days when someone reported that I was not white. And there was a young woman whose desk abutted mine that we were both very new. We had become friends very quickly. And I saw the lieutenant in our section motion her to come up to his place. And she did. And their faces were red and they were talking. And when she came back to her desk, I asked what that had been, because obviously they were looking at me while they were talking. And very red-faced, she said, he was telling me that you're colored. I jumped up and went to the front to the desk and said, why, what difference does that make? Well, who told you that I wasn't colored, Well, as it was, it turned out, he said, no, don't worry, Betty. I mean, we really, I've talked with all of your workers and your supervisors and everyone is willing to work with you. And I thought, work with me? Are they going to work under me if I get my transfers, my upgrades?
Right.
And he said, we'll see that you get your pay. And I went back to my desk and picked up my purse and walked down on the Air Force, while my husband, who was young, had left USF, where he was playing left halfback for the San Francisco Dons in his senior year. He had volunteered to fight for his country during the same period, found himself at Great Lakes. He was a third-generation Californian. Not only his grandmother, his father, and he were all born in Berkeley General Hospital. And he had never had any experience with the system of segregation because he'd never been in the South. He got before a board of examiners because he refused at a time when that just wasn't heard of. But he said, I offered to fight for my country, not to cook. They held him for 3 days, finally accepted the fact that he was sincere, that there wasn't any way that they were going to be able to make a sailor out of him. So they decided that they were going to give him an honorable discharge, mustering out pay, put him on a bus for home. And not before telling him that he obviously was a natural leader of men, but that they couldn't put a man like that aboard a ship because it might spell mutiny at sea. He came home in disgrace and shame and went to his grave with that story, never even telling his kids, because he felt that he had failed his country. Now, while he was gone, that had happened to me with the Air Force. He came back. We never told anyone about this because his friends were all going off and fighting, flying with the Air Force with Tuskegee. He came back, began to work as a playground director at San Pablo Park in Berkeley as an assistant coach in the daytime and at the shipyards at night. I got a job with the union, which was the segregated union, because the labor movement would not be racially integrated for another decade. But that was our experience with the Second World War. Neither of us made it.
And in that vein, can you talk about why you say you never identified with the Rosie the Riveter campaign?
No, because that was a white woman's story. The women in my family had been working outside their homes since slavery, because in 1942 it took $47.25 a week to support a family of 5. $47.25 a week, if you can believe it. But that was if you were white. Our fathers and our uncles were all members of the service workers generation. They were the Pullman porters and the red caps and bellhops and the janitors and the laborers. And our mothers were 35 to 50 cents an hour domestic servants, cleaning white people's houses and taking care of white people's children, because it had always taken 2 wages to support black families. It's not rocket science. I mean, few black men could do it in the service sector. So that when the park was being created in Richmond, I was a field representative for a member of the California State Assembly, attending those planning meetings as a state employee, but realizing that this park was being created to honor the white women, the women who had worked as Rosies, but that I didn't identify with it because, as I say, the women in my family were not a part of that. And I wasn't boycotting it. It simply didn't say anything to me. So I didn't ever do that. Now, what I did do, and my fingerprints are all over that park, What I did do was to, in that position as a consultant, because I became very shortly thereafter a consultant to the National Park Service, realizing that there was an incredible feminist story to be told. And that was the story of Rosie the Riveter, and that needed a kick-ass white feminist who was just as enthusiastic as I was about my story, about that story, and that needed to be, but that story was incomplete. That there was also the story of 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans who were interned and lost 2.5 to 4 years of their lives of freedom. And much of their treasure, as it turned out, not a single case of sabotage or any kind of disloyalty was ever proven against any of them. And they lost their freedoms and their resources simply because they looked like the enemy. It was simply a simple case of racial profiling. That story needed to be told because that was an important story at the home front. There's also the story of that great explosion at Port Chicago. 320 lives were lost, 202 of them being black dock workers. The only time in history that we ever tried 50 people in a single trial because 50 of those men refused to go back and load their ships because nobody understood what had caused the explosion. I mean, it was all of the officers at Port Chicago were white, and all of the dock workers were black, and all of the whites were given 30 days trauma leave, while all of the black dock workers were ordered back to work, picking up body parts, putting them into 22 caskets, which were buried over at San Bruno Cemetery and the Sunset Cemetery as unknowns in the colored section. And it wasn't until I was a park ranger that I realized that there was a colored section in a federal cemetery on the West Coast. There were so many stories, and those stories are going to be ignored as we allowed that park to be a little more than a celebration of white women's emancipation into non-traditional labor. That the home front story was much bigger than that. And that when we give up our complexity, we give up much of our truth, and that truth needed to be shared. And that was the reason I became a park ranger at 85, because you guys had forgotten all that stuff.
How often, I know you speak at the park a few times a week, how often have you had people come to your presentations and say, my grandmother, my great-grandmother?
Absolutely. I think 3/4 of the people who walk in there want to talk about their story. They don't want to talk about ours. My great-grandmother was,
Worked at the shipyard.
And that is fine. I think that really is a great, well, the thing I've learned from being a park ranger, by dealing with the public in that way, is that there are many truths, and that some of those truths are in conflict. There's a place on the film that we show, it's an orientation film, where Agnes Moore, a still living white Rosie, says it was the greatest coming together of the American people that I have ever lived through. And when that film was first released to us, and I'd stand against the wall and I'd watch the people's faces in the half light, and I'd think, how can Agnes say that? She knows that isn't true, and I'm going to talk to that woman. And one day after my 90th birthday, I began to hear that as Agnes's truth, when I realized that probably was the greatest truth that Agnes had ever lived through. The greatest coming together of the American people that she'd ever lived through, but that my truth was equally true and needed to be told. And as long as there's a place on the planet where those truths can coexist, that was going to be enough for me. And it's true that is what happens at that park. Those truths coexist because they are equally true. Yeah. Thank you.
I feel like that's a message that the country could use right now, that there's more, but, and I know you sell out, right?
We get it mixed up with fake news.
Right, exactly.
That's not what I'm talking
Alternative
about.
facts, right, totally. Okay. And I know you sell out oftentimes if we wanted to go see you at the shipyard, right? Your presentations sell out, your speeches.
We are now booked through May.
Yeah.
But you see, the secret is that we have a theater that only holds 48 people, so I sell out like, like Hamilton.
I know, actually, one of your quotes that you often say in this sort of conversation reminds me of Hamilton. What gets remembered is a function of who is in the room doing the remembering.
Absolutely, absolutely. It is, what gets remembered is determined by who's in the room doing the remembering. We have to be in the room, and that's what I've been. I've simply been in the room.
Yeah, the room where it happens. So let's talk about the civil rights movement. What was your involvement? I know you were involved with the Black Panthers to some extent, but also during this time you were living in a suburb that was predominantly white. You were one of the few
Absolutely,
families of color.
completely white, yeah.
Yeah.
That was a struggle for me. It's a struggle that almost cost my sanity. I literally went through a mental break at a point where I think my youngest was about 3. At a time when I was living in a world that I was trying to make rational a world that simply was irrational. Reclaiming my sanity was a struggle to finally accept the fact that I was living in an insane world. And I was sane within that. And that is literally how I did it. But the Civil Rights Revolution found me at a time when I wasn't quite white enough for the suburbs, and I wasn't quite black enough for the Black Revolution. And I was in a church, a Unitarian church, where I think that we were the only black family actually in the first until a second one came in. I think there are now 3 or 4. But I was almost schizophrenic because I was on a national black committee of the Black Caucus of the Unitarian Church, funded by a completely white church, who was contributing to the Black Revolution through me. I was living in the suburbs, going into Berkeley to march with the Panthers on the Alameda County Courthouse. I was participating in fundraisers I was a bag lady for the Panthers, delivering money that I was raising in the suburbs to Kathleen Cleaver and in San Francisco. It was a period where it was hard to hold on to sanity because very little was rational in my life then. I almost didn't. I finally worked through that, and interestingly enough, I worked through it through music, through creating music. I taught myself to play guitar. I found a way to travel distances deep inside myself because there was no way to escape the fact that my youngest child was born with brain damage at birth, was going to need care for all of her life. I had to find ways to travel while she hung onto my skirt. And I went inside to where my 6-year-old, to whom everything was possible, lived. What I finally came to was the fact that there was a legitimate role for a middle-class African American who wasn't quite black enough for this revolution or white enough for the suburbs, that I was choking on power. I could have parked my car on the City Hall lawn because the mayor was a member of my church and a dear friend. The leaders in that community, the liberal communities, were people that I interacted with constantly. But those were the people who held the power that the urban folks were fighting and dying for, and that no one was going to grant power to a man with a brick in his hand standing on the corner in Oakland, but that I was choking on it, and that my role as a middle-class, empowered person was to be a conduit for that power, and to accept it, and to deliver it to where it belonged. And that was the role that I chose, and that's the role that saved me, because I learned to do that. I learned to be an interpreter for two sides of my life. And that was the only way I could retain my sanity.
At that point, did you see yourself as an activist?
No. I was doing what I needed to do to survive. I wasn't defining myself. I only know, in looking back, that those are the words that describe what I was then, but I didn't know. No.
I've heard you say that you feel essentially like currently you're living in the future that you were fighting for in the 60s.
I have lived long enough to have lived into the future that, along with millions of others, I helped to create in the 60s. And I've lived into that future. I think that that's amazing. Yeah. On the other hand, we are creating the future that my grandchildren will live in right now. Right now.
Do you, living in this future, do you think that we're farther along than you thought we'd be, not as far along? Have we gone back?
No, but my definitions have been changing as I've aged. When I was a child, I believed that I guess all through high school, that the democracy was promised to me, there was entitlement that came with my birth. And I was offended and enraged, along with everyone else during the 60s, because those promises were unkept, and after all, they're mine. Until I reached an age, maybe began in my 60s or 70s, where I began to understand that democracy is simply an unfulfilled promise, but it was envisioned by imperfect people, that that every generation has to recreate it, that it's no more than a promise, that it's, oh God, I'm still working that out. And here's where it gets mixed up, because now I know that these periods of chaos are cyclical, that they've been happening since 1776, that we're in another one of them now, but it's in those periods of chaos that democracy is being redefined. That's when we have access to the reset buttons. That's also when we make the giant leaps forward. That I'm not enslaved like my great-grandmother was. That it's like we're on an upward spiral. We keep touching the same places at higher and higher levels. But that democracy has to be redefined. That it's never going to be fixed. That the magic words for me are forming that more perfect union. That's going to be the constant. We will always be forming that more perfect union. The assumption is that it's not perfect. And it wasn't until a few months ago, I gave a talk at SUNY Broome, one of the New York community colleges in upstate New York. And when I walked into that room, it was filled with teachers and faculty, very diverse, but you could cut the despair with a knife. It was so strong. SUNY apparently is in Trump country. I knew when I walked in the room, because I'm very intuitive, that despair was there, and I was fighting against it the whole time I was talking. But when I walked away, at the end, the hugs were really warm. I could tell that something had happened. And it wasn't until I was on the plane ride home that I realized something had happened, but it was inside me, that I had been disappointed as a kid in the unfulfilled promises. But I suddenly realized that I had been transformed either at some point along the way. That there was no office of fulfillment. There was no secretary of fulfillment. That each of us becomes a fulfiller at some point. That we have to fulfill those promises. And that's what had happened in that room with those kids. That I had realized that like my womanness, I had to declare my independence as a woman, and that didn't happen until the men in my life died. And it had always been there. I could have declared my independence all my life, but I'd never seen that as a possibility until the men were removed from my life. And then I had to be Betty. I was no longer Betty Charbonnet or Betty Soskin or Betty Reid. I was Betty, and I didn't know who in the hell that was. But it was also true as a fulfiller, that I had somehow transformed into a fulfiller. But I hadn't known when that was, and that had always been there. And that being a victim is simply incompatible with being a fulfiller. As long as I saw myself as a victim, I was not going to be a fulfiller. But that I had become that, and that somehow that had come full center in that classroom at SUNY Broome. And I came back, and that didn't come until my, 90s? Mid-90s? That I am still evolving. I am still becoming. That's an amazing thing.
That is,
I'm speaking. I've been speaking for Nike, for Salesforce, for Google, for Facebook, for... I'm sitting in rooms where everyone is under 30, and all those things that my generation is still striving for are taken for granted by a generation that has already seen the changes I'm still looking forward to. I've become the subject of a virtual reality. I've sat in my room, in my home, looking at myself through the Oculus headset and taken with a camera that has a 360-degree image. It's like being out of body. To have lived into that time, you should all do it.
oh, there's so much. There's so much I want to unpack from what you just said. I love how self-reflective you are. When we talk about that moment of chaos, though, that we're in, that we might be in right now, something that I found fascinating that you've said, and so I'd love you to expand on, is, and it makes sense, but it sounds shocking, is that you were elated by Charlottesville.
Absolutely. I sat and watched Charlottesville. I watched those tiki plates, and I was feeling elated. And for a while, I couldn't think, why in the world is this? But I finally realized that the sheets were off, that the masks were down, that there was nowhere to hide anymore, that there was going to be a whole generation of people suddenly who are going to understand that many of us have lived with domestic terrorism for generations, that it was no longer possible to hide any place. And that for me was really, really hopeful, because the people who have become pseudo-liberals, who really believe that they've already figured it out. I mean, come on. There simply is no place to hide. And we have an administration where that is becoming painfully true. I think that the leaps forward now are so much more powerful, and that they are so much more possible because of what we're seeing. Does that make any sense to anybody? Yeah.
So I want to ask you then specifically about here in Sacramento, because the city is going through a bit of a period of unrest, particularly this past week. We saw protests throughout the city after the decision of Stephon Clark. And so what is your, sounds like you've been following that. I'm kind of curious to get your take on that, and what you think it will take to heal the community and get past this.
Oh, I wish I were wise enough to know. Because I don't know that anyone knows. We have now seen, sadly, a pattern of tolerance for these kinds of things, because we're no longer surprised by them. And that's tragic. And I don't know what the answers are. I wish I did. I don't know.
Your message, though, to the youth that have been out there protesting?
I think the most hopeful thing is that there are that the percentage of people of color who were marching in the streets in the 60s are not the percentages we see now. We're seeing people in the streets who are black and white and Asian and orange and green, and we're seeing people of all ages, we're seeing people of all economic classes, all marching on principle. That's a whole different story. And I think that that's probably the most powerful thing that I can tell you.
Why have you never run for office?
Because I was busy hanging white shawls on capos. And I think I made the right choices. I really do. I really do. I think that my instinctive choices were right. I think that as I ran into blocks, I simply grew off different edges. And I think that I'm still doing that.
It's not too late to run for office, maybe. But I guess it sounds like
You've got to be Justin. I've been looking.
Justin is my boyfriend, who's also photographed Betty.
How long ago did you photograph me there? And I remembered him.
Yes, that photo on the poster back there is his photo, the one of, I love that photo.
Yeah, he was with Getty.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, you spotted him. So I think you were trying to get around, I feel like you're getting around my question about running for office. You were trying to deflect.
No, I seriously, I have never aspired to run for office.
But you've been wooed. I guess that's why the question, it sounds like people have kind of asked you or wooed you to, and you just never really felt.
Yeah, but it never seemed to, I'm not even sure what the reason is, except that I didn't ever feel adequate to it. It's like I never went to college. I think I got a non-traditional PhD because I married a professor at the University of California. But I really never did. It wasn't until I was a faculty wife, I think, that I began to get a strong sense of my place in the world intellectually, because I realized that my husband, who was an eminent psychologist, research psychologist, knew everything there was to know about this much of the world. He didn't know at a very high level. And that I did know at a very low level.
Since it is International Women's Day, and I think you sort of touched on this with your answer there, but I wanted to ask you, sort of as a young woman, I think women can be sort of overcome with self-doubt. And I know Michelle Obama talks about this in her book, Becoming, and how, have you ever experienced that? It sounds like you have, and how have you overcome it?
I'm not sure I've ever overcome it. I think that I remember when I married Bill that I kind of overcompensated. But I always felt that if I know this much, think of what they know. All the people around me who had advanced degrees, and I was so impressed with that it wasn't until, I guess, 5 years maybe into that marriage that I began to see their humanness and not be intimidated by it. But I really was in awe because I'd never been to college. I was in awe of people who had advanced degrees. That may have been why I never saw myself as being adequate. Mm-hmm. But I've since had 2 honorary doctorates. I'm still wondering why. Yeah.
As a 90-year-old myself,
Yeah.
I really love what life has done for you. I hate the things that happened to you, but I love you.
There isn't 1 minute that I regret of my life. Yeah.
They're true.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank
They're
you.
there.
Yeah.
And then that's what's the end.
Yeah.
Wasn't always sweet. There's only one disagreement I have in the whole show, and that was the Japanese. Because we forgot there were 4 Japanese diplomats sitting in Washington
Yeah.
signing a peace treaty when they bombed Pearl Harbor.
Right. Right.
And there were Japanese killing our kids, black and white, in the Philippines, in the most brutal way possible. And I think you would find it still difficult to sell the Japanese to us back then. It's,
No, but
the rest of it,
the thing that I see you doing is that the families that I work with
say it again, please, I'm sorry.
the families that I work with in the National Park Service.
Families are always the
Oh, wait a minute. Those families, the Sakai family, came to the United States in 1899, and Charlotte Sakai's great-grandfather is one of the co-founders of the Japanese, of the flower market in San Francisco. The Nehemiah family came in 1913. These were not Japanese. They were Americans. And what you're doing is you're trying to equate what was happening in the Second World War with Japanese people, who were our enemy. This is not. Okay, no, but that's what I was hearing. That's what I was hearing.
no problem whatsoever. None.
Yeah.
But back then, it was dangerous. And the reason
It was dangerous, but you have to disconnect Japanese Americans from Japanese. You really do.
your head,
Okay. No, I can get vicious.
Do you see yourself as an icon?
No. No, but it was really, really great to get to be named by Glamour magazine as a Woman of the Year.
Yes, I know. I love that photo of you.
Yeah, I really am wondering whoever arrived at that. I don't know.
Okay, you've had many lives.
Yes.
And many more to come. What life do you look back on most fondly?
I think that my greatest satisfaction came from producing and raising children. I really, really love the fact that I think I gave birth to my best friends. And that really has been, yeah. Everything else fits around it.
And you have a long lineage, great-grandchildren?
Yes.
Great-grandchildren too?
Yes.
How old are your great-grandchildren?
3. No, yeah.
Oh, okay. What's on your bucket list still?
I'm trying to find a Faustian bargain for another 10 years. Because I'm going to go kicking and screaming.
But like, I know some, like flying, jumping on a plane, like anything extreme on a bucket list?
No, my life has provided so much that I can't imagine wanting anything more. If I died tomorrow, I am way, way overdrawn at the life bank.
So RBG, we always look at her as just another female icon who has her intense workout she does every day. Do you have anything that you do daily to keep active?
The only exercise I get is jumping in and out of cars.
Any other secret? I mean, some people say, oh, I have a glass of wine a day or anything.
No, lots of peanut butter maybe.
Good to know. I do like peanut butter. So, I mean, we'll open it up to questions now, but I guess last question for you now is when we talk about how we're in your future now, but what about your great-grandchildren's future in 50 years, 60 years? What do you hope that future is like?
I know how my generation met the threat of its day. Many threats. I think that the one that consumes my life now is that threat of the World War. But the fact that we've been engaged in wars ever since that time. I would wish world peace for my children. I don't know how we're going to deal with rising sea levels and global warming and climate change, but I do believe that the answers are already with us, that they're going to emerge from a generation to come. I have great faith in the fact that that's going to happen. I don't know what the world's going to be like for my kids. I come from a time where the rate of change has been accelerated to such an extent that my grandfather could tell my father what the world was going to be like when he grew up and preparing for it, and it would be that way. And my father could maybe tell me, and maybe get there. I don't know what the rate of change now. Generations are measured in 3-year cycles. I mean, I don't know what the world is going to be like, so I wouldn't guess. I wouldn't attempt to guess how my kids or my grandkids what they're going to do. But I know, I am absolutely convinced that the answers that we so sorely need are already upon us, that they've been born, that someone said that the person who's going to live to be 150 has already been born. And someone else said, I hope it's Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Shall we open it up to a few questions? Do we have time for a few questions? Lisa? Cool. Okay, anyone?